My father thought today was my execution. I stood alone in the courtroom without a lawyer, and everyone assumed I was broke. The whole town watched, waiting for my ruin. Then, his high-paid attorney looked at my file and turned completely pale. Realizing he was standing on the wrong side of a legal explosion, in that exact moment, my father learned a lesson way too late. My long silence was never weakness. I was just learning how to legally end him. I am 41 years old. I stepped out of the freezing rain and into the heavy, suffocating air of the Marlow County Civil Court. It was a bleak morning in North Carolina, the kind of morning that soaked through your coat and settled deep in your bones. But the chill inside courtroom number 4 had nothing to do with the weather outside. It came from the wooden benches. It came from the people sitting on them. The room was packed far beyond its capacity. Every single seat was taken. People lined the back walls, standing shoulder to shoulder, their wet umbrellas dripping onto the faded linoleum floor. Briar Glen was not a large town. People here lived on local drama and whispered secrets. Today, the main event was me. They had crammed into the gallery, eager for blood. They wanted to see the rebellious daughter finally crushed. They wanted to watch the great Mercer family take out their own trash in public. I walked down the center aisle. I did not rush. I carried 3 heavy cardboard boxes of documents. I held one tightly in my arms. I pulled the other 2 stacked on a rusted metal dolly behind me. The wheels squeaked faintly. That was the only sound in the room. The murmurs and whispers died down the exact second I pushed through the heavy double doors. I wore a simple dark blue suit, flat shoes. My hair was pulled back tight against my scalp. A pair of reading glasses rested on my collar. I did not look like a woman begging for mercy. I did not look like a victim seeking pity. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on the judge's bench. At the defense table sat my father, Randall Mercer, the real estate and logistics titan of our county. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire apartment. He sat perfectly straight, his chest pushed out, owning the space. He looked like a king waiting for a peasant to kneel. He owned the local warehouses. He owned the trucking routes. He basically owned half the town council. Beside him sat my brother, Cole Mercer, the golden boy, the heir apparent. Cole was scrolling on his phone, acting completely bored, playing the part of the untouchable prince who had much better places to be. And flanking them both was their ultimate weapon, Vernon Pike. Vernon Pike was not just a lawyer. He was a corporate executioner. He charged $1,000 an hour to bury his client's enemies under mountains of procedural motions. He was the man you hired when you wanted to drain the opposing side of every single penny before a trial even began. Pike leaned back in his expensive leather chair. He tapped a heavy gold pen against his legal pad. He did not even bother to look up when I reached the plaintiff table. I was nothing to him. I was just another annoying bug to be squashed before his lunch break. I set my boxes down. The dull thud echoed loudly in the high ceiling room. I opened the top box and pulled out my primary binder. Randall turned his head. He looked at me, taking in my damp suit and my distinct lack of legal counsel. He looked at the empty chair beside me. A cruel, practiced smile stretched across his face. He leaned back. He took a slow breath. He spoke. He did not whisper to his lawyer. He projected his voice so the sound would carry perfectly to the crowded gallery behind us. You could not even afford a lawyer. The words hung in the stale air. They were designed to cut deep. They were a public declaration of absolute power, a reminder of my place at the bottom of his world. A few scattered chuckles drifted from the back rows. My father's friends, his golf partners, his dependent contractors. They were laughing with him. They were laughing at me. The crowd believed him completely. Of course they did. For the past 8 months, my father had fed them a single, relentless narrative. He had painted a masterpiece of character assassination across every country club dinner and church gathering. According to the gospel of Randall Mercer, I was mentally unstable. I was bitter and crazy after a messy divorce. I had suffered a breakdown, sabotaged the family company files out of pure spite, and then come back crawling, demanding unearned financial benefits. They all thought I was here to throw a desperate pathetic tantrum. They thought I was a broken woman trying to squeeze a few pennies from a generous, long-suffering father. I did not answer him. I did not flush with anger. I did not lower my head. I simply opened my thick binder and laid it flat on the dark oak table. I arranged my pens. I took a slow, steady breath. The heavy wooden doors behind the bench swung open. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. Judge Celeste Wren walked in and took her seat high above us. Judge Wren was an absolute institution in Marlow County. She had iron gray hair cut in a sharp, unforgiving bob. She had eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She did not tolerate time wasters. She did not entertain fools. She adjusted her microphone. She opened the case file placed before her. She looked down at the paperwork. Usually, when a self-represented litigant stands before a judge, you see a flash of deep irritation in the judge's eyes. You see pity mixed with annoyance. People who represent themselves usually bring messy, handwritten complaints full of emotional rambling and zero legal standing. They waste the court's precious time. Judge Wren looked at my filing. She did not sigh. She did not blink. She turned the first page, then the second. The silence in the room began to stretch. It stretched so long that the gallery stopped shuffling their wet feet. People stopped coughing. People held their breath. Judge Wren's eyes moved rapidly across the dense text. She paused. She traced a line with her finger. There was no pity in her gaze. There was no annoyance. There was only razor-sharp professional caution. She looked at the document as if she had just reached into a dark drawer and touched the cold steel of a loaded gun. It was a look of pure, unadulterated respect for the danger hidden in those pages. She looked up from the binder. She looked straight at me. She did not say a single word, but the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew thinner. The pressure dropped. At the plaintiff table, Vernon Pike let out a quiet sigh of boredom. He reached out with his manicured hand and pulled his copy of my opposition binder toward him. He expected a joke. He expected a handwritten plea about family fairness and emotional distress. He expected something he could get dismissed in exactly 5 minutes. He casually flipped open the heavy cover. I watched his hands. I watched his face. Pike grabbed the corner of the first page to turn it. But his fingers suddenly stopped. His hand froze completely in midair. His eyes darted to the top left corner of the document. Then his eyes snapped to the center. Then to the footer. The expensive gold pen slipped from his grip. It clattered loudly onto the wooden table. Pike flipped quickly to the next page. Then the next. He turned the pages faster and faster. His breathing changed. The smug, relaxed posture vanished instantly. His shoulders tensed so hard they practically touched his ears. The healthy color completely drained from his face. His expensive tan seemed to wash away right there in the chair, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man facing a firing squad. He stared at the signature block. He stared at the forensic accounting seals. He stared at the complex case citations and the specific formatting of the financial reconstructions. He recognized the work. He recognized the brutal, surgical precision of the legal arguments. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the paper. He whispered. The courtroom was so utterly silent that his whisper carried across the tense gap between our tables. My God, is that really her? It was barely a breath. But it was enough. It was everything. Randall heard it. He frowned heavily. He turned his head to look at his high-priced lawyer. For the first time in his long, arrogant life, my father saw Vernon Pike lose his rhythm. Pike was not looking at the judge. Pike was not looking at my father. Pike was staring dead at me. His eyes were wide. They were filled with a sudden, suffocating panic. He was looking at me like I was a ghost. He was looking at me like I was a predator that had just quietly locked the courtroom doors from the inside. Randall shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The triumphant, mocking smile slipped right off his face. Complete confusion replaced it. He looked from his terrified lawyer to the stack of papers, and then finally, he looked back at me. His eyes searched my face. He tried to find the frightened little girl he used to yell into submission. He tried to find the daughter who always backed down to save the family name. I met his gaze. I did not blink. I felt my pulse beating slow, calm, and steady. I was totally at peace. Randall did not know yet. He was about to find out. The woman he had gleefully prepared to humiliate in this courtroom was gone forever. She died the day he locked her out of the office and destroyed her good name. He still thought he was dealing with the loyal daughter he used to control with shame and guilt. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him inside those 3 cardboard boxes. I did not grow up in a normal family. I grew up inside a localized power structure. In a place like Briar Glen, the Mercer name was a master key that unlocked every single door. It was the kind of name that made the local bank manager keep the heavy glass doors open a full hour after regular business hours just because my father needed to make a late deposit. It was the kind of name that made the church elders smile a little wider and offer the front pews on Sunday mornings. Whenever my father walked into a crowded room, the entire local business council stood up in unison to shake his hand. They called him the rebuilder of Briar Glen. He absolutely loved that title. He wore it like a heavy gold crown, and he made sure everyone in our household polished it daily. Inside our house, the rules were never written down, but they were carved into the very foundation. The son inherits the kingdom. The daughter handles the dirty work nobody else wants to touch, cleans up the messes, and then stays perfectly quiet about it in the background. That was the natural, undisputed order of things in my father's universe. Cole was born to stand in the spotlight on the podium. I was born to sweep the floor beneath it and make sure the microphone worked. But I was never a fragile thing. I never cried when things got hard, and I never waited for someone to rescue me. I observed. I learned exactly how systems worked. I had a mind that naturally gravitated toward hard logic and concrete facts. I was exceptionally good at risk analysis. I could read a 300-page commercial contract and find the single lethal loophole hidden deep in paragraph 42. I understood complex financial structuring better than most bankers. Most importantly, I had a talent for spotting anomalies in massive sets of data. I could look at a messy corporate ledger and instantly see where the numbers were lying. I used those specific skills to build my escape route. After finishing law school, I packed my bags and moved to a major city on the East Coast. I did not want to practice traditional courtroom law. I moved into the intense world of corporate compliance and risk restructuring. My specialty became business failure analysis. I spent my days walking into massive corporations that were rapidly bleeding cash and figuring out exactly why they were dying. I ripped apart their broken financial models, found the deep operational rot, and rebuilt their compliance frameworks from the ground up. I sat across from arrogant executives who had ruined their companies and showed them exactly where they failed. I built a very quiet, very successful life for myself. I was far enough away to actually believe I had completely escaped the massive, suffocating shadow of the Mercer family. Along the way, I got married. It did not last. The divorce was quiet, amicable, and finalized a few years ago, but when I walked out of that marriage, I kept his last name. I remained Lillian Watson. I did not keep the name out of lingering affection or heartbreak over my ex-husband. I kept it because my entire professional identity was built upon it. Every law degree, every corporate compliance certification, every published paper on risk assessment and business failure analysis was registered to Lillian Watson. My father absolutely hated it. He brought it up at every holiday dinner, his voice dripping with condescension. He said keeping a dead marriage's name was pathetic and weak. He even tried to force the Human Resources Department to put Mercer on my company email when I eventually returned, but I knew the real reason it bothered him so deeply. Being a Watson meant I was not a Mercer. It was a daily, legally binding reminder that I existed entirely outside his jurisdiction. Then my mother got sick. Elaine Mercer was the quiet, steady buffer between my father's massive ego and the rest of the world. When her health started failing rapidly, the family company started trembling right alongside her. Mercer Corridor Group had expanded way too fast. My father and Cole had bought up too much industrial land, signed too many high-interest commercial loans, and completely ignored the necessary operational foundation required to support that kind of aggressive growth. They were drowning in their own ambition. My father called me on a cold Tuesday night. He did not ask for a favor like a normal parent. He gave a directive. He used a tone of voice that implied I owed him my very existence. He told me to come home for just 6 months. He said he needed exactly 6 months to stabilize the system so he could focus entirely on taking care of my dying mother. It was the perfect trap, baited with family duty and a daughter's guilt. I packed up my independent life and drove back to Briar Glen. I truly believed it was a temporary mission. A daughter doing her duty during a severe family crisis. The company was an absolute disaster zone. It was a textbook case of business failure playing out in real time. I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. I spent 16-hour days untangling their massive mess. I reorganized their entire commercial insurance portfolio, which was full of dangerous coverage gaps. I reviewed hundreds of sloppy vendor contracts and renegotiated the terrible terms Cole had agreed to. I pulled 3 massive commercial loans back from the absolute brink of default by restructuring their financial covenants at the 11th hour. I cleaned up literally hundreds of operational errors that my brother had made simply because he refused to read the fine print or follow basic compliance rules. I built a functioning, profitable machine out of the rusted scrap metal they handed me, but the promised 6 months passed. Then a year passed. The more things I fixed, the harder it became to leave. Every single time I tried to hand the reins back to them and pack my bags, another manufactured crisis would suddenly appear out of thin air, requiring my specific, high-level expertise to solve. And the most sickening part of all was watching how my exhausting work was digested by the family public relations machine. Every loan I saved, every brutal compliance audit I passed, every financial disaster I quietly averted behind closed doors was smoothly repackaged for the public. At town hall meetings, charity galas, and Chamber of Commerce dinners, my father would proudly slap my brother on the back. He would announce to the crowded room that Cole was doing an absolutely fantastic job navigating the company through a very tough economic quarter. I was never mentioned. I was the ghost in the machine. I was the invisible engine making the golden boy look like a genius. It took me far too long to understand the dark reality of my situation. I used to think my father resented me because I was a woman, or because I was not his chosen heir to the local throne. But sitting in that dark office late at night, watching Cole take full credit in the local newspaper for a complex risk mitigation strategy I had spent 3 weeks building from scratch, the cold truth finally hit me. My father did not hate my talent. He actually relied on it to survive. He desperately needed my brain to keep his empire from collapsing. The only thing Randall Mercer truly hated was the fact that my talent existed entirely outside his direct control. He did not bring me back just to fix his company. He brought me back to break my independence. He wanted to own my mind the exact same way he owned those massive logistics warehouses out on Highway 9. He wanted to consume my identity until there was nothing left but a useful tool for the Mercer legacy. The lifeblood of Mercer Corridor Group was concrete, steel, and government disaster relief funds. We operated in a very specific, highly lucrative sector. We bought up massive tracts of cheap industrial land, developed sprawling logistics warehouses, and aggressively bid on post-hurricane redevelopment projects along the eastern seaboard. In that specific industry, the physical construction was only 20% of the actual work. The other 80% was navigating a brutal, suffocating labyrinth of federal regulations, state environmental permits, and municipal tax codes. Where massive streams of public and private cash flowed, mountains of complex paperwork followed. Before I returned to Briar Glen, the company was drowning in that paperwork. They were losing bids because their financial disclosures were a complete mess. I was the one who stopped the bleeding. I locked myself in a windowless conference room for 14 hours a day and built a bulletproof internal compliance framework from scratch. I designed rigorous auditing protocols. I standardized our vendor vetting process. Because of my architecture, the company suddenly qualified for massive federal redevelopment grants. We secured multi-million-dollar commercial credit lines at incredibly low interest rates. We locked in state tax exemptions that saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars a quarter. Naturally, at the end of the fiscal year, my father stood at the head of the boardroom table, raised a glass of expensive bourbon, and proudly credited every single one of those financial victories to Cole. My brother loved the applause. He thrived on the adrenaline of closing a big deal and the prestige of shaking hands with state senators. What he absolutely hated was the slow, meticulous process of doing things legally. He despised being checked. He viewed my compliance framework not as a shield protecting the company, but as an annoying speed bump slowing down his personal ambition. Cole started finding creative ways to bypass my system. It started small. I noticed that several new landscaping and site clearing vendors had been onboarded without completing the mandatory background financial checks. They were shell companies. Backyard suppliers set up by his drinking buddies to catch the runoff cash from our massive construction budgets. Then I noticed the payment structures. Cole was intentionally breaking down large vendor invoices into smaller, distinct clusters of payments. He was authorizing wire transfers just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold to avoid triggering automatic bank alerts and internal compliance reviews. In the world of corporate finance, we call that structuring. In the eyes of the federal government, it is a massive red flag for fraud. I started digging deeper into the digital archives. That was when I found the first forged document. It was a routine soil testing clearance invoice for a new warehouse development out on the county line. The invoice had a strange, irregular approval stamp. I pulled up the digital routing log. My blood ran cold. Right there at the bottom of the screen, glaring back at me, was my own electronic signature. The system recorded that I had personally reviewed and approved the clearance at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I had never even opened that specific project folder. I had never seen that invoice in my life. I checked another file, then another. My digital signature was stamped across dozens of expedited payments that completely bypassed my department. I immediately printed the logs and walked straight into Cole's corner office. I dropped the papers flat on his glass desk and demanded a full, independent forensic audit of the entire payment system. Cole did not even flinch. He just laughed. He leaned back in his leather chair, tossed his pen onto the desk, and smoothly blamed the entire discrepancy on a glitch in the recent accounting software migration. He said the system must have automatically populated my signature block during the server transfer. He was lying, and we both knew it. I told him software glitches do not authorize specific wire transfers to unvetted subcontractors at 2 a.m, before Cole could spin another lie. My father walked into the office. He closed the heavy oak door behind him. He looked at the printed logs on the desk. Then he looked at me. His expression hardened into a familiar mask of paternal disappointment. He did not ask what the documents were. He did not ask why I was upset. He simply wanted the conflict to end so the machine could keep moving. He told me to lower my voice. He said I was overreacting to a minor administrative oversight. When I pushed back, pointing out the severe legal liabilities of forged compliance documents, he cut me off completely. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, and lowered his voice into a dangerous, commanding register. "Do not act like an outside lawyer," he said. "You are family." That single sentence was the psychological skeleton key to his entire operation. It was the ultimate weapon of silence. Whenever I demanded professional standards, whenever I pointed out a blatant violation of the law, they threw the word family in my face. It was designed to make me feel disloyal. It was meant to twist my professional ethics into a personal betrayal. They demanded the rigorous expertise of a high-paid corporate attorney, but they expected the blind, unquestioning obedience of a silent daughter. They wanted the benefits of my brain without the friction of my conscience. I left the office that afternoon with a sickening realization. The rot was not just confined to our internal servers. If Cole was attaching my electronic signature to domestic invoices, what else were they putting my name on? I spent the next 48 hours secretly mirroring the outbound email servers. I needed to see exactly what was being sent to our external financial partners. I sat in my dark apartment, drinking black coffee, parsing through thousands of encrypted attachments. The truth I uncovered was far worse than petty embezzlement or lazy contracting. My father and my brother were using my hard-earned professional reputation as a bulletproof shield. Every single credit application sent to the regional banks, every risk assessment forwarded to our commercial insurance brokers, every bid submitted to the State Development Board prominently featured my credentials. They were explicitly leveraging my unblemished history as a corporate compliance officer to secure funding for projects that were fundamentally toxic. The banks trusted the Mercer Corridor Group solely because Lillian Watson was listed as the chief guarantor of regulatory adherence. My name was the only thing making their dirty money look clean. The final terrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place late on a Friday night. I was reviewing a secured loan packet for a massive, multi-phase logistics hub planned near the riverfront. It was the absolute crown jewel of my father's expansion strategy, but the land sitting beneath the proposed site was highly unstable. It was an old chemical dumping ground that required millions of dollars in mandatory environmental remediation before a single shovel could touch the dirt. The liability was astronomical. If the chemical seepage reached the nearby water supply, the resulting federal fines would bankrupt the company overnight. Attached to the final page of the loan guarantee was a formalized certificate of environmental compliance. It falsely stated that all preliminary soil remediation had been successfully completed according to strict federal standards. And sitting right at the bottom of that fraudulent, highly illegal document was my verified electronic signature. My stomach violently twisted. The air in my small apartment suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The humming of the computer server sounded like a ticking clock. This was no longer a story about a narcissistic father refusing to share the spotlight with his capable daughter. This was no longer about a lazy brother cutting corners to look successful. This was a fully realized, meticulously planned criminal conspiracy. They were not just stealing my labor, they were actively weaponizing my identity. They knew the riverfront project was a toxic time bomb. They knew the company was heavily over-leveraged and drowning in hidden liabilities. They had intentionally designated me as the clean, highly credentialed face of their most dangerous gambles. They were quietly building an airtight paper trail that pointed directly to my desk. When the environmental regulators finally arrived with their testing kits, when the banks realized the land collateral was absolutely worthless, when the entire fragile empire inevitably collapsed under the weight of its own staggering fraud, Randall and Cole would simply walk away. They would feign ignorance. They would hand the federal authorities my digitally signed compliance certificates. They would play the tragic victims of a rogue, mentally unstable compliance officer who had hidden the truth from her own trusting family. I sat in the dark and stared at the glowing computer screen. The trap had not been built with steel wires or heavy chains. It had been built with corporate emails, forged digital signatures, and weaponized declarations of family loyalty. They had spent the last 2 years setting me up to take the fall for their massive crimes. They thought they had trapped a loyal, obedient daughter who would quietly take the blame to save the family name. They thought my sense of duty would override my sense of self-preservation. They were completely wrong. They had trapped a woman who made a living destroying corrupt corporate structures from the inside out. And they had just given me complete access to their entire structural blueprint. I followed the digital paper trail away from the fraudulent compliance certificates and toward the actual physical assets of the company. I needed to see exactly where the clean money was going while the toxic liabilities were being piled onto my desk. I pulled the deeds for the massive riverfront logistics park and the extensive portfolio of inland warehouses. I knew these properties intimately. I had spent countless sleepless nights negotiating with aggressive regional creditors, restructuring interest rates, and rewriting operational covenants just to keep those specific buildings out of foreclosure. I had saved them from total liquidation 3 separate times. When I opened the state registry files, the breath left my lungs. The properties no longer belonged to the primary Mercer corporate entity. They had been quietly and systematically siphoned off. They were transferred via a series of complex holding trust agreements into a newly formed limited liability company, I pulled the incorporation documents for the new entity. The sole managing member, owning 100% of the voting shares and the profit rights, was Cole. Years ago, when I first drove back to Briar Glen, my father made a very specific promise. We sat on the back porch of the family estate, looking out over the manicured lawn. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I successfully restructured the massive corporate debt and saved the company from bankruptcy, I would receive a permanent long-term equity stake in the commercial portfolio. He promised me a real structural piece of the legacy I was building, but looking at the cold, hard data on the state registry, I saw the absolute truth. Every single verbal promise had evaporated the exact second the ink dried on the restructured bank loans. I was completely erased from the wealth I had salvaged with my own two hands. They did not just want my labor. They wanted to ensure I never owned a single brick of the empire I kept from crumbling. The deepest emotional blow landed 2 nights later. It was the annual County Business Association dinner, held at the most expensive country club in the region. It was a lavish, over-the-top affair. Hundreds of local executives, politicians, board members, and bankers filled the grand ballroom, drinking expensive wine and patting each other on the back. My father stood at the main podium under the bright spotlights. He raised his crystal glass to the crowded room. He did not talk about the near bankruptcies. He did not mention the severe compliance failures or the brutal audits we had barely survived. Instead, he looked directly at my brother sitting at the head table. My father's voice boomed through the speakers, calling Cole the brilliant, visionary architect of the strongest financial growth in our company history. The entire room erupted in massive, thunderous applause. Bankers who had threatened to seize our assets just a year ago were now standing up and cheering for my brother. Then, almost as an afterthought, my father pointed vaguely in my direction at the end of the table. He smiled a tight, incredibly patronizing smile. He told the wealthy crowd that I was his daughter who had come home to help out, and that I was always very good with paperwork. Good with paperwork. It was a deliberate, public castration of my professional identity. It reduced years of high-level forensic financial engineering into the image of a quiet secretary filing receipts. I looked across the table at my mother. Elaine sat in her wheelchair, her breathing shallow, her thin frame wrapped tightly in a heavy wool shawl. Her eyes met mine through the noise of the clapping crowd. Her eyes were filled with a profound, agonizing sorrow. She knew exactly what her husband was doing. She knew the entire scope of his cruelty and his theft. She had watched him do it to others for decades. But her body was failing rapidly, and she simply did not have the physical or mental strength left to confront him. She gave me a look of pure, helpless apology, and then she slowly looked away, staring down at her untouched porcelain plate. The final, fatal knife turned later that same week. I was reviewing a separate stack of contingency filings in the physical archives room when I found a notarized document buried inside a mislabeled manila folder. It was a personal financial guarantee agreement. It was attached directly to the Environmental Remediation Contingency Fund for the old, chemically compromised warehouse site. This document went far beyond a forged electronic signature on a compliance certificate. This piece of paper legally bound me, personally, to cover the total cost of the toxic cleanup if the corporate development funds ran dry. My name, my personal bank accounts, my future wages, and my entire professional livelihood were legally pledged against millions of dollars in potential federal pollution fines. I marched straight up to the executive suite with the physical document shaking in my hand. I walked into my father's office and demanded a complete explanation. Randall did not even flinch. He did not raise his voice. He calmly took off his reading glasses, placed them on his leather blotter, and folded his hands. He looked at me with the bored expression of a man explaining a basic concept to a slow child. He told me it was merely a temporary measure. He claimed the banks required a clean, unencumbered personal guarantor to meet a strict quarterly filing deadline, and that Cole was already overextended on other collateral. Then, his voice dropped an octave, turning cold and incredibly hard. He looked at me with calculating eyes and reminded me of my place. He said the family had generously taken me in when I came crawling back to town after my failed marriage. He said they had given me a purpose and a salary when my personal life was falling apart. He leaned forward and stated that it was finally time for me to pay my debt to the family. He slid an expensive gold pen across the polished desk. He told me to sign the retroactive confirmation and stop being so dramatic. I stared at the pen. I stared at the man who shared my blood, realizing he would gladly throw me into federal prison just to save a few acres of poisoned dirt. I refused to touch the pen. I turned around and walked out of the room without saying a single word. Their retaliation was incredibly swift and absolutely total. When I arrived at the corporate building the next morning at 8 o'clock, my electronic keycard flashed solid red. The heavy glass security doors remained locked. I walked back to my car in the rain and tried to log into the virtual company server from my laptop. My administrative access credentials had been completely wiped. The screen simply read, "Access denied." 10 minutes later, a private security courier knocked on my car window. He handed me a receipt and demanded I immediately surrender my company-issued mobile phone and laptop. In the span of 24 hours, I was completely severed from the very system I had built. By noon, a thick legal envelope was slipped under the front door of my small apartment. It was a comprehensive severance package, drafted meticulously by Vernon Pike. The terms inside the document were legally sickening. If I wanted to receive a meager 2 months of basic living expenses, I had to sign a clause explicitly admitting to severe administrative errors and gross negligence in the compliance department. The package also included an ironclad non-disclosure agreement that would legally gag me for the rest of my natural life. They were trying to force me to purchase my own silence by signing a false confession. If I signed it, I would willingly hand them the exact loaded gun they needed to blame me for the environmental fraud. But the true, suffocating horror of their plan was not the firing, the locked doors, or the aggressive legal threats. The real shock was how fast and how perfectly they weaponized the entire town against me. By Friday evening, a single, perfectly synchronized narrative had flooded the streets of Briar Glen. I did not have to read the local paper to hear it. I felt it everywhere. I heard the whispers at the grocery store. I saw the judgmental stares at the gas station. Randall and Cole had seeded the story with surgical precision through their vast network of country club friends and church elders. The town was buzzing with the tragic, pitiful news about the Mercer daughter. People whispered that I had become dangerously unstable. They said the pressure of the job had completely broken my fragile mind. They claimed I was still bitterly acting out from my divorce. The story they swallowed whole was that I had completely botched the corporate files out of sheer, hysterical incompetence, caused massive financial damage to my generous father, and then simply ran away when confronted with my massive mistakes. They did not just want to take my money and my labor, they wanted to completely rewrite history. They needed to publicly destroy my credibility so thoroughly that if I ever tried to stand up and tell the truth about their massive financial frauds, I would sound like nothing more than a crazy, bitter woman looking for petty revenge. They left me with zero income, no legal representation, and a ruined reputation in a town that worshipped the very ground they walked upon. They expected a storm. My father and brother built their entire strategy on the assumption that I would react like a wounded animal. They waited for me to bang on the heavy glass doors of the corporate headquarters. They waited for me to call the local newspaper and scream about the massive injustices I had suffered. They anticipated tearful voicemails and furious text messages demanding an explanation. Instead, I gave them absolutely nothing. I severed the cord. I disappeared completely from their emotional radar. I did not call. I did not write. I packed my remaining personal belongings into the trunk of my car and drove away without looking back in the rearview mirror. I needed a place to regroup, a bunker where their influence could not reach me. I found it directly above the old, independent pharmacy on the edge of town. It was a tiny, drafty apartment with peeling paint and pipes that groaned whenever the wind blew. The rent was exactly $450 a month. To survive the initial shock of having zero income, I liquidated the few expensive items I owned. I sold a diamond necklace my ex-husband had given me for our 5th anniversary. I pawned a vintage watch I had bought with my first big corporate bonus. I secured enough cash to keep the lights on and buy groceries for at least 8 months. I did not ask a single person in Briar Glen for a loan. I refused to give my family the satisfaction of seeing me beg. 3 weeks after I moved into the apartment above the pharmacy, my mother passed away. Her death was quiet, a slow fading out that mirrored how she had lived her final years inside that sprawling estate. I attended the funeral, standing at the very edge of the cemetery, far away from the front row where my father and Cole played the roles of the grieving patriarch and the dutiful son. I left before the final prayer. 2 days later, a probate attorney sent me a thick manila envelope. Inside was a small, brass padlock key and a piece of paper detailing a lease for a climate-controlled storage unit on the highway. The unit was registered solely in my mother's name. I drove to the facility late at night. I expected to find old photo albums, childhood keepsakes, or perhaps her collection of antique porcelain that my father hated looking at. I slid the metal door up. The overhead bulb flickered on. There were no sentimental souvenirs inside. There was no porcelain. The small room was stacked from floor to ceiling with heavy-duty plastic bins, tightly bound banker's boxes, and several metal filing cabinets. It was an archive. My mother had never been a rebel. She never raised her voice at dinner, and she never openly challenged my father when he verbally crushed people to get his way. But she was not blind. She knew exactly who she was married to. She understood his terrifying habit of making a promise in the morning and completely denying it by the afternoon. She knew he lived his life rewriting reality to suit his needs. So, in the total silence of her long marriage, she became a meticulous historian. She hoarded the truth. She kept everything, operating like a ghost preparing for the inevitable day when the actual facts would need to be proven. I sat on the cold concrete floor and started opening the boxes. The sheer volume of raw data was staggering. I found printed email chains dating back almost a decade. I found handwritten meeting notebooks detailing off the record board discussions. There were thick stacks of unedited insurance policies and original vendor contracts before Cole had taken a black marker to the terms. Most importantly, I found a small waterproof lockbox containing 4 external hard drives. I plugged the first drive into my laptop. The drive contained hundreds of hours of raw audio files. They were digital recordings of internal corporate conference calls. I clicked on a file dated roughly 7 months prior, right around the time the massive riverfront warehouse development was aggressively expanding. The audio was crystal clear. I heard my father's voice, sharp and commanding. I heard him explicitly ordering the finance department to push millions of dollars in secondary vendor payments through the system immediately. I heard a junior accountant nervously state that the external auditors had not yet reviewed the specific risk profiles for those accounts. My father cut the accountant off, demanding the wire transfers happen before the sun went down, specifically stating they needed to bury the invoices before the audit team arrived the following Monday. I listened to the recordings until the sun came up. This was no longer just my word against theirs. This was not a vague moral dispute about a daughter being treated unfairly by a patriarchal family. This was hard, undeniable evidence of systemic, deliberate fraud. The documents and audio files in my mother's secret vault did not just show isolated incidents of bad judgment. They formed a cohesive, undeniable pattern of criminal behavior. I could take these pieces and build a perfect, 3-dimensional model of corporate deception that any judge would instantly recognize. My mother had given me the exact ammunition I needed to tear the empire down. As I dug deeper into the legal correspondence files, I noticed something incredibly revealing about Vernon Pike. The legendary, undefeated corporate lawyer was fundamentally blind. I found the draft versions of the legal packets that my father and Cole had submitted to his high-priced firm. They had never shown Pike the raw, unedited data. They had never disclosed the backdated property transfers or the forged environmental compliance certificates. They only handed him the sanitized, heavily scrubbed versions of the company history. Pike was aggressively defending an illusion. He was marching into battle entirely unaware of the massive landmines his own clients had buried in the field. That specific realization crystallized my entire strategy. I could have taken those hard drives straight to the state regulatory board. I could have dropped the audio recordings on the desk of a hungry investigative journalist and watched the Mercer family burn on the front page of the Sunday paper. But a media scandal was entirely too messy. It left room for public relations spin. It allowed my father to play the victim of a vindictive daughter. No, I wanted something far more permanent. I wanted to trap them inside the very system they thought they controlled. I wanted to force them into a sworn deposition, under penalty of perjury, and let them build their own gallows. I was going to use the strict evidentiary standards they weaponized against others to crush them completely. I closed the final box and locked the storage unit. The cool morning air hit my face as I walked back to my car. I felt a fundamental shift inside my chest. It was the absolute death of hope. For 41 years, a tiny, pathetic part of me had always wanted my father's approval. I had worked myself to the bone hoping he would finally see me, respect me, and love me. That part of me was now entirely dead. I no longer cared about being loved. I no longer cared about family loyalty. I drove back to the small apartment above the pharmacy, sat down at my desk, and opened a blank legal file. I only thought about one thing. I was going to build a fortress of evidence so dense and so lethal that absolutely no one in Briar Glen could ever distort it. Survival requires capital. War requires an endless supply of it. My emergency fund was finite, and I needed an income stream that existed entirely outside the suffocating borders of my home county. I could not risk my father tracking my finances through the local banking network. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not called in over 4 years. I called Naomi Rourke. Naomi was my former boss back in the city. She was a woman made entirely of sharp angles, tailored suits, and even sharper instincts. She was now a senior partner at Blackridge Special Situations. Blackridge was not a standard, polite law firm. They were a boutique corporate warfare outfit. They specialized in handling massive corporate fraud, complex commercial debt restructuring, and vicious board control disputes. They were the people you hired when millions of dollars went missing into the dark, and you needed someone ruthless to rip the corporate floorboards up to find the rats. Naomi answered on the second ring. I did not waste her valuable time with a tearful, emotional backstory. I laid out the bare bones of my current situation. I told her I was completely cut off, facing aggressive legal threats, and currently preparing to completely dismantle a heavily entrenched local monopoly from the ground up. I asked if she had any remote overflow work for an independent forensic contractor. Naomi listened quietly. She did not offer a single word of easy comfort. She did not express pity or outrage on my behalf. She let a long, heavy second pass before she finally spoke. She asked me a very simple, cutting question. Do you want to be coddled, or do you want to win a genuinely difficult case? I told her I wanted to win. She hired me on the spot. I became a ghost operative for Blackridge. I sat at the small, rickety wooden table in my drafty apartment and transformed my isolated living space into a tactical forensic command center. Naomi sent me heavily encrypted digital files from massive corporate disputes happening 3 states away. My life became a masterclass in extreme, punishing discipline. I did not rise from the ashes like some beautiful, mythical bird. I clawed my way back to the surface through sheer, relentless manual labor. Every single day started exactly at 5 o'clock in the morning. I laced up my running shoes and ran 6 miles through the dark, freezing streets of the town. I ran past the local diners where men sat drinking cheap coffee and fully believing the vicious lies my family sold them. The grueling physical exhaustion burned away the lingering anxiety. It left my mind entirely clear, sharp, and totally cold. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting at my desk. I spent the next 10 hours doing deep, structural analysis for Naomi. I audited massive, convoluted commercial loan portfolios. I tracked hidden payment chains through dense layers of offshore holding companies. Let me explain exactly what it means to analyze a corrupted payment chain. It is not just looking at a bank statement. It is building a psychological profile of a white-collar criminal. You have to understand why a specific, seemingly random amount was moved on a specific Tuesday afternoon. you have to look at the digital metadata attached to the wire transfer. You have to find the invisible hand pushing the button. I spent weeks staring at glowing monitors until my eyes burned. I tracked phantom dollars as they bounced from a primary developer to a shell company, and then finally to an unlisted trust account. I built massive, sprawling digital maps that exposed illegal cross-ownership structures. I scrubbed thousands of lines of server code looking for tampered electronic signature logs in high-stakes financial lawsuits. I was doing the exact same kind of forensic hunting I needed to do for my own impending case, but I was getting paid $250 an hour to do it for someone else. I deposited my first Blackridge paycheck into a brand new, highly secure offshore business account. The sight of those 5 figures hitting the ledger was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of pure tactical relief. I finally had my war chest. When the sun went down, the contract work ended, and my personal war preparation officially began. I drank another pot of black coffee and spent the next 6 hours studying. I did not just passively brush up on general legal theory. I surgically memorized the state civil procedure codes. Studying state procedural law is like studying the anatomy of a machine gun. You do not just learn what it does. You learn exactly how to take it apart and put it back together blindfolded in the dark. I memorized the strict rules regarding the evidentiary discovery phase. I learned the precise legal mechanisms required to forcefully compel the production of hidden corporate documents. I practiced drafting subpoenas that were so aggressively narrow and legally sound that absolutely no judge could ever throw them out. I read countless recent appellate rulings on the admissibility of metadata and electronic server evidence. Most importantly, I studied the brutal psychological art of cross-examination strategy. I learned exactly how to corner a hostile witness on the stand using nothing but the crushing weight of their own contradictory paper trail. I worked until 2 a.m, slept for 3 restless hours, and then woke up in the dark to run again. During this grueling period of isolation, I filed the necessary paperwork with the State Bar Association and the National Accounting Boards. I fully reactivated every single professional license and financial certification I held. I registered them all cleanly under my full legal name, Lillian M. Watson, back in my hometown. That specific name meant absolutely nothing. It was just a target for country club gossip. But out in the broader, highly competitive world of high-stakes commercial disputes, that name was slowly beginning to mean something entirely different. The massive turning point happened late in the autumn season. Naomi assigned me to a massive, incredibly toxic debt restructuring case based out of Raleigh. A large commercial property developer was actively trying to declare bankruptcy and wipe out over $40 million in unsecured debt. Their defense lawyers were aggressive, incredibly expensive, and extremely confident in their position. They had successfully buried their clients' hidden assets under a massive mountain of complex, seemingly legal subsidiary transfers. The Blackridge legal team was hitting a solid brick wall in court. I took the developer's entire financial history and broke it down to the absolute molecular level. I spent 90 straight hours comparing their internal ledger dates against the county property tax assessments. Eventually, I found the fatal, hidden flaw. I discovered a 14-day window where the subsidiary holding companies technically did not legally exist, meaning the massive asset transfers were legally void from the moment they were signed. I wrote a 40-page forensic analysis detailing exactly how the developer committed systematic bankruptcy fraud. My analysis was a masterpiece of lethal accounting. I did not use aggressive adjectives. I did not use emotional language or make moral judgments. I used cold, hard, undeniable math. I built a chronological timeline so airtight that it left the opposing counsel absolutely zero room to maneuver. Naomi took my printed analysis into the final settlement conference in Raleigh. She dropped my report on the polished mahogany table. The opposing counsel, a team of 20 seasoned corporate lawyers, read my findings and completely folded within 2 hours. They surrendered entirely. Word travels incredibly fast in the small, insular community of commercial litigation. People started asking Naomi exactly who found the structural flaw in the Raleigh case. She gave them my full name. Almost overnight, My name began circulating quietly among the top-tier commercial lawyers and financial forensic experts across the entire state. They started actively seeking out my independent consulting services to solve their own impossible cases. That specific case in Raleigh taught me the most vital lesson of my entire career. It fundamentally changed how I viewed the impending legal battle with my own family. I finally realized that the most dangerous person in a courtroom is never the person shouting the loudest. It is never the man with the most expensive custom suit or the biggest local reputation. The truly dangerous person is the quiet professional sitting at the table who knows exactly which specific piece of paper will make the loudest opponent lose their voice completely. While I was out building this lethal new reality, my father was sitting in his plush climate-controlled office, smoking an expensive cigar, firmly believing I was struggling to pay my winter heating bill. He thought the total isolation would eventually break my spirit. He thought poverty and social shame would force me to surrender. He pictured me crying in a dark room, totally desperate for his forgiveness and a small allowance. He was completely oblivious to the monster he had inadvertently created. I was not starving. I was upgrading. I was systematically stripping away every single weakness, every ounce of emotional sentimentality, and every remaining trace of the obedient, desperate daughter he once knew. I was forging myself into the exact type of relentless professional that veteran lawyers double-check their own files for before daring to underestimate. My revenge was not going to begin with a sudden, messy explosion of anger. It was not going to be a dramatic, screaming confrontation on his perfectly manicured front lawn. It was going to be a quiet, highly methodical execution. I was elevating my own capabilities to such an extreme level that the men who had casually crushed me would not even recognize the apex predator standing directly in front of them until the steel trap had already snapped shut on their necks. The total isolation of my new life broke on a freezing Tuesday evening. Someone knocked hard on the heavy wooden door of my apartment above the pharmacy. I looked through the peephole and saw Milo Serrano standing in the pouring rain. Milo was the former systems administrator for the entire corporate network. He looked completely exhausted, his shoulders slumped under a soaked jacket. My brother had fired him without warning exactly 14 days prior, publicly blaming him for a massive, catastrophic failure in the digital security protocols. But Milo was not a careless employee. He was meticulous. Before the private security guards escorted him out of the main lobby, he quietly copied the master access logs onto a heavily encrypted flash drive. I let him inside. He sat at my small kitchen table, opened his laptop, and pulled up the raw server data. He did not ask me for money or a job. He just wanted to clear his own professional name. He pointed to a specific sequence of glowing green text on the black screen. He showed me the exact digital footprint of the person who had completely locked me out of the system. The server logs provided absolute proof that my administrative credentials had not been hacked by some random outside threat. They were manually overridden and hijacked from an internal internet protocol address. That specific address was hardwired directly into my brother's private office. Even more damning, the timestamps clearly showed that my verified electronic signature was actively being stamped onto external environmental compliance documents, while my physical security badge was logged completely off the premises. They were stealing my identity from inside the building. 72 hours later, another ghost from the company payroll reached out from the shadows. Paige Harlan owned a small, struggling landscaping and site preparation firm that relied entirely on our corporate contracts to survive the winter months. She asked me to meet her at a dark, completely empty diner out on the desolate county highway. Her hands physically shook as she held her coffee mug. She confessed that my brother had recently approached her with a highly illegal arrangement. He promised her a guaranteed monthly retainer fee if she allowed him to route heavy equipment invoices through her corporate checking account. She admitted she was acting as a blind pass-through station. The money flowed straight from our primary corporate treasury, landed briefly in her small business account, and was immediately wired out to an unlisted holding company. She had absolutely no idea who actually owned the holding company, but she kept meticulous physical copies of every single routing number because she was terrified of a federal tax audit. I took the folded papers from her shaking hands. The routing numbers matched the exact newly formed entity controlled entirely by Cole. The external pieces of the puzzle began falling into my lap almost simultaneously. A senior credit specialist at the regional commercial bank called me late at night on a disposable prepaid phone. I had worked closely with him during the massive debt restructuring phase. He was risking his entire career by making the call, but his professional conscience was eating him alive. He confirmed the exact scenario I had suspected from the very beginning. The internal risk committee at the bank had specifically approved a massive series of highly irregular financial exceptions for our newest expansion projects. They only approved those risky loans because my clean, unblemished compliance certifications were attached to the front of the packets. They trusted my rigorous professional integrity. They completely ignored the glaring underlying red flags because my name served as an ironclad, undeniable guarantee of regulatory adherence. Shortly after that terrifying phone conversation, I took a quiet, unnoticed trip down to the county records basement. I spoke with a veteran filing clerk who had owed my late mother a massive personal favor for over a decade. I asked her to pull the physical property transfer logs for the massive riverfront parcels. She brought out the heavy, leather-bound ledger books. I compared the official county ink stamps on the deeds against the chronological sequence written in the master registry. They completely contradicted each other. The physical transfer documents had been illegally backdated by several months. They altered the timeline to create the false legal illusion that the valuable land was safely moved into my brother's private control long before the toxic environmental liabilities were fully discovered on the site. I returned to my apartment and pinned every single piece of gathered evidence to the cracked plaster wall. I used red yarn to connect the financial transactions and blue yarn to connect the digital access logs. I did not look at these elements as separate, unfortunate corporate accidents. I arranged them into a single, cohesive, horrifying narrative of premeditated theft. The entire operation was sickeningly elegant in its cruelty. They systematically weaponized my flawless professional reputation to secure massive amounts of institutional funding. They simultaneously shifted the astronomical environmental and financial risks entirely onto my personal ledger. Once the capital was safely secured, they quietly funneled the clean, profitable real estate assets directly into my brother's private control. Then, right before the rotten foundation was scheduled to crack wide open, they erased my system access, fabricated a loud public narrative regarding my mental instability, and threw me out into the street to take the eventual criminal fall. I stopped gathering information. I started firing back. I walked straight down to the district courthouse on a Monday morning and filed a massive, highly detailed civil lawsuit against the holding company, my father, and my brother. I did not ask for a polite, quiet settlement behind closed doors. I formally petitioned the court for a total declaratory judgment to completely invalidate the fraudulent personal guarantee bearing my forged digital signature. I demanded a court-ordered injunction to immediately freeze all ongoing corporate asset transfers across their entire portfolio. I requested full, unrestricted forensic access to their internal communications servers. Most importantly, I filed a motion to officially determine my actual structural role within the disputed corporate entities. I wanted to legally destroy their pathetic narrative that I was merely a low-level employee doing basic administrative paperwork. My father did not retreat. He possessed an ego that simply did not comprehend the concept of surrender. He escalated the war immediately. Less than 48 hours after my initial filing, his high-priced legal team filed a vicious, incredibly aggressive countersuit against me. Vernon Pike drafted a brutal document that formally painted me as a deeply bitter, emotionally unstable former employee acting entirely out of spite and family jealousy. The countersuit openly accused me of engaging in a malicious campaign of familial harassment. They claimed I was attempting to extort my generous father through frivolous, baseless litigation. Randall was executing the classic, brutal game of corporate attrition. He knew I had zero formal income on paper. He firmly believed his overwhelming financial advantage would crush me. He fully intended to drag out the legal discovery process for years. He planned to bury me under massive mountains of expensive procedural motions and completely drain my limited financial resources. He thought he could starve me out until I was forced to sign a suffocating settlement agreement just to avoid living on the street. He planned for a long, slow, agonizing siege. But he fundamentally failed to account for the massive internal weakness of his own son. The sudden, highly public court filing of my lawsuit sent a massive shockwave straight through the regional financial sector. The commercial lenders actively monitor the local court dockets for risk. One of our primary institutional backers read the injunction filing and instantly panicked. They immediately froze a massive, multi-million-dollar financial expansion package that Cole desperately needed to keep his new shell companies afloat. They flatly refused to release the pending construction funds until the legal dispute was completely resolved. That single frozen credit line completely shattered my brother's arrogant, untouchable facade. The Golden Boy panicked entirely, operating under the terrifying sudden realization that his untraceable cash flow was completely dead. My brother rushed back to the executive office late at night and began frantically trying to cover his muddy tracks. He started mass deleting sensitive internal emails. He altered digital vendor contracts in the system. He hastily shifted funds between various accounts, trying to hide the shell companies from the impending court subpoenas. But Cole was not a systems architect. He was just a thief in a very expensive suit. He did not realize that every single time he hit the delete key on his keyboard, the main server generated an automatic, highly encrypted backup file in a hidden directory. In his absolute desperate panic to destroy the evidence before the judge could see it, the Golden Boy was systematically generating a massive, irrefutable digital footprint pointing directly toward his own undeniable guilt. The trap was finally springing shut, and they were the ones pulling the lever. My father understood perfectly that a courtroom was only one specific type of battlefield. He preferred the court of public opinion, where he was the undisputed judge, jury, and executioner. As the legal deadlines drew closer, he launched a massive, highly coordinated social offensive across the entire county. He did not yell or scream in public. He used the quiet, devastating power of disappointed whispers. At the Sunday morning church service, he stood in the grand vestibule shaking hands, bowing his gray head in manufactured sorrow whenever my name was brought up. Out on the manicured greens of the local golf course, between expensive swings, he told his wealthy friends how heavily this tragic family situation weighed on his aging heart. At the annual hospital charity dinners, he smoothly turned my complex legal claims into a tragic joke about a daughter who simply could not handle the pressure of the real world. He painted a masterful, sickening portrait of paternal grief. He made absolutely sure every single influential person in our social circle believed I was entirely disconnected from reality. The public humiliation was a calculated strategy designed to soften me up for the actual strike. It happened on a rainy Thursday night. Cole showed up completely unannounced at the bottom of the wooden stairs leading to my apartment. He did not look like the arrogant golden prince anymore. The frozen commercial credit lines had carved deep, dark circles under his eyes. His expensive suit was wrinkled. He stood in my narrow hallway, dripping cold water onto the floorboards, and handed me a thick manila envelope. It was a formal settlement offer. He tried to frame it as an act of brotherly mercy, speaking in a low, conspiratorial whisper. He offered me a lump sum of cash, enough to cover my basic living expenses for roughly 5 years, along with a heavily scripted, private apology. In exchange, the demands were absolute. I had to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement that would gag me for the rest of my life. Furthermore, I had to formally sign a document accepting full legal responsibility for the alleged administrative shortcomings. He wanted me to sell my professional soul and swallow his crimes just to buy my way out of the war. I stood in my small, drafty kitchen, holding the heavy envelope. I looked at the massive amount of money printed on the front page. For one fleeting, incredibly exhausting moment, I almost cracked. I was so unbelievably tired. The psychological weight of being utterly despised by my own hometown, of walking past neighbors who looked at me with open disgust, was actively crushing my spirit. I felt the deep, agonizing temptation to simply sign the paper, take the money, move 3,000 miles away, and never think about the family empire ever again. I did not care about the cash itself. I just fiercely craved an exit strategy that did not involve publicly dismantling my own flesh and blood under the harsh fluorescent lights of a courtroom. I walked over to the stack of cardboard boxes my mother had left me in the storage unit. I opened the top lid, looking for nothing in particular, just needing to touch something real to ground myself. Right on top of a stack of old insurance policies was a small, torn piece of yellow notepad paper. I recognized Elaine's slanted handwriting immediately. It was a single sentence she had written down during one of my father's previous, unrelated corporate battles. "He is betting that you will be ashamed before he has to be." That single sentence hit me like a physical blow. It ripped away the heavy exhaustion and replaced it with a blinding, cold clarity. My father was actively weaponizing my own inherent sense of decency against me. He knew I hated public scandals. He was heavily counting on my ingrained habit of protecting the family reputation to force my ultimate surrender. I folded the small yellow note, put it securely in my pocket, and handed the unread settlement offer directly back to Cole. I told him to leave my house and never come back without a federal subpoena. Down at the district courthouse, Vernon Pike was executing a legal strategy based entirely on supreme arrogance. He officially filed a massive motion to dismiss my entire lawsuit. His legal briefs treated my meticulously documented claims as a petty, irrelevant internal family squabble. He deliberately peppered his filings with thinly veiled sexist tropes, leaning heavily into the narrative that I was simply a bitter, resentful woman lashing out after a difficult divorce. Pike firmly believed that wrapping my case in the ugly clothing of a domestic dispute would completely blind the judge to the raw financial evidence buried in the exhibits. But Judge Celeste Wren did not care about country club gossip or expensive legal posturing. She actually read the initial evidence I submitted regarding the backdated property transfers and the manipulated server logs. She immediately issued a decisive ruling that sent a massive shockwave straight through the defense table. She flatly denied Pike's motion to dismiss. Furthermore, she completely bypassed the standard, drawn-out written discovery phase that Pike was relying on to drain my funds. She ordered a direct, mandatory evidentiary hearing. That specific ruling changed the entire landscape of the war. It meant there would be no hiding behind written affidavits crafted by expensive public relations teams. My father, my brother, and their entire legal team would be forced to sit in a physical room, under oath, and answer direct questions in front of a live audience. With the trial date officially set, I faced a critical strategic decision. Thanks to the massive offshore paychecks I was earning from my remote consulting work, I possessed more than enough liquid capital to hire a top-tier corporate litigation team from the city. I could have hired a ruthless bulldog attorney to stand in front of me and do the heavy shouting. I deliberately chose not to. I officially filed the paperwork to represent myself. I did not do it out of arrogance or a desire to save a few $1,000s. I did it because I needed absolute, surgical control over the narrative. If I hired an outside lawyer, they would naturally try to soften the blows. They would look for professional courtesy, a way to make the destruction of a prominent local businessman look slightly less ugly for the sake of courtroom decorum. I did not want decorum. I wanted to hold the scalpel myself. I wanted to dictate the exact rhythm of their collapse, beat by beat, without any external filters making it easier for them to swallow. I spent the final 2 weeks barricaded inside my apartment, transforming the chaotic mountain of raw data into a lethal, streamlined weapon. I built a comprehensive, strictly color-coded physical filing system. I bought dozens of heavy-duty binders and stacked them across my living room floor. The red binders contained the irrefutable proof of the illegal cash flow and the hidden vendor payments. The blue binders held the certified digital access logs, proving the internal identity theft and the server manipulation. The yellow binders tracked the backdated asset transfers and the fraudulent real estate deeds. The gray binders contained the exact transcripts of their own wildly conflicting testimonies and public lies. Finally, there was one single, thick black binder. The black binder held the absolute kill shots. It contained the exact, unredacted documents that would permanently destroy their professional credibility and leave them entirely defenseless against federal auditors. As the days ticked down to the hearing, I completely stopped going into town. I stopped running in the early mornings. I vanished entirely from the public eye. Down at the local diner and the hardware store, the residents of Briar Glen took my total isolation as a clear, undeniable admission of defeat. They whispered happily over their coffee cups that the crazy daughter had finally run out of steam. They assumed I was hiding in my dark apartment, too terrified to face the righteous anger of my powerful family. They thought my quietness meant I was losing the war. They did not understand the fundamental nature of the battlefield I had built. I had stopped defending myself in public because I no longer needed the audience to believe my story. Public opinion is a fragile, entirely useless thing when you are holding absolute, mathematical proof of a crime. I did not need their sympathy or their understanding anymore. I had something infinitely more powerful than the approval of a corrupt hometown. I had the complete, unbreakable structure of the truth, perfectly categorized by color, and waiting patiently to be unleashed. The night before the hearing, the air in Briar Glen grew heavy, cold, and completely still. It was the suffocating, terrifying silence that always preceded a devastating storm. The entire town seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see exactly how the famous family would publicly execute its rogue member. Across town, sitting at the head of a massive mahogany dining table inside his sprawling estate, my father hosted a private dinner for his inner circle of dependent executives and loyal golf partners. He poured expensive aged scotch into heavy crystal glasses. He raised his drink to the ornate ceiling and promised the sycophants sitting around him that tomorrow morning he was finally going to put Lily back in her absolute proper place. He did not view the impending trial as a legitimate legal threat to his massive empire. He still viewed me entirely as a domestic discipline problem. To Randall, the county judicial system was merely another blunt instrument he could comfortably use to enforce total family obedience. While my father arrogantly celebrated his guaranteed victory with his wealthy friends, my brother was actively drowning his mounting anxiety in cheap liquor. Cole drank entirely too much in the dark corner of his massive modern living room. The frozen commercial credit lines were slowly suffocating his private shell companies, and the immense pressure was cracking his golden boy facade. His tongue grew loose, careless, and incredibly arrogant. He stumbled into the master bedroom and began loudly bragging to his wife about their brilliant, foolproof legal strategy for the following morning. In his drunken stupor, he let slip a massive, fatal secret. He laughed uncontrollably as he admitted that their terrifying $1,000 an hour lawyer, Vernon Pike, had absolutely no idea who he was actually fighting. Pike had thoroughly reviewed several highly specialized financial documents bearing the name Lillian M. Watson, but the arrogant lawyer had never once connected that professional corporate signature to the broken, emotional daughter he was preparing to humiliate. Cole's wife sat quietly on the edge of the mattress, listening to her husband ramble and boast. She was entirely sick of the suffocating, toxic Mercer family dynamic. For years, she had silently watched the men in the family constantly force the women to swallow their pride, hide their intelligence, and remain perfectly quiet just to protect fragile male egos. She despised the way they casually destroyed people to maintain their flawless public image. Late that night, long after Cole had passed out face down on the expensive cotton sheets, she picked up her mobile phone. She sent me a highly encrypted, completely anonymous message. She explicitly warned me that the opposing legal team was fully preparing a brutal character assassination protocol. Their entire courtroom strategy relied heavily on painting me as an unqualified, completely hysterical woman who had zero professional standing or legal capacity to even read the complex corporate ledgers, let alone audit them for fraud. I sat alone in the dim, flickering light of my small apartment and read the glowing text message on my phone screen. I did not panic. I did not feel a sudden rush of fear. I calmly walked over to my desk and opened the thick black binder resting firmly on the wooden surface. I turned the heavy pages until I reached a specific, deeply buried file. I wanted to verify a document that seemed incredibly small, but was absolutely, fundamentally toxic. It was the official public registry and case wrap-up of a massive corporate restructuring lawsuit that had taken place in Raleigh exactly 2 years ago. Vernon Pike had been the lead defense attorney for the corrupt developer in that specific case. He had lost that massive trial catastrophically. He lost because the opposing counsel had completely dismantled his aggressive defense using a flawless, bulletproof financial forensic analysis report. I looked down at the formal signature line on the bottom of that old, archived report. The brilliant structural analysis that had publicly humiliated Vernon Pike, completely destroyed his defense strategy, and cost his prestigious firm millions of dollars in the settlement, had been personally authored by a remote forensic consultant named Lillian M. Watson. I stared at the thick paper in the quiet room. I could have easily sent a digital copy of that specific document to Pike's downtown office that very night. I could have attached a dramatic, intimidating email, injected a massive dose of theatrical panic into their ranks, and watched them desperately scramble in the dark hours before dawn. But I deliberately chose not to alter my carefully laid strategy to add cheap, dramatic flair. I completely stripped away every single piece of unnecessary theatrics. I decided to let the horrifying realization happen completely organically inside the physical courtroom. I wanted the cold steel blade to be drawn incredibly slowly. I wanted the famous lawyer to walk into the room overflowing with supreme, unchallenged confidence, look down at my full credentials, and experience the agonizing, real-time realization that he had walked directly into an inescapable trap set by the exact same ghost who had already defeated him once before. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I lay completely still on the small, uncomfortable mattress, listening to the freezing rain violently hit the thin window glass. My profound insomnia was not born from a lingering fear of losing the case. I did not doubt my evidence for a single second. I stayed awake because I fully understood the massive, crushing gravity of the approaching dawn. Tomorrow morning was the absolute point of no return. The exact second the judge slammed her heavy wooden gavel to open the hearing, my entire personal history would be permanently, irrevocably rewritten. After the trial concluded, regardless of whether I won a massive judgment or lost on a technicality, I would never be the same person again. The quiet, obedient, desperate daughter was going to officially die on the courtroom floor, and I needed to spend those final, silent hours making complete peace with her fading ghost. The sun eventually rose behind a thick, heavy blanket of dark gray clouds. The morning air was bitterly cold. At exactly 6 o'clock, I stood in front of the small bathroom mirror. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot against my scalp. I put on a simple, dark blue suit that offered absolutely zero visual distractions. I slid my feet into sensible, flat shoes, designed specifically for standing firm and unmoving on hard marble surfaces. I did not wear a single piece of jewelry. I did not apply any makeup to hide the deep, dark circles under my exhausted eyes. I gathered my heavy cardboard boxes from the living room floor. I only packed the exact physical items, server logs, and printed emails that I could unequivocally prove to the absolute bitter end. I drove to the district courthouse in absolute ringing silence. I kept the car radio turned off. The sprawling asphalt parking lot was already overflowing with vehicles. When I finally pulled into a narrow spot near the very back edge of the property, the freezing rain continued to fall in a steady, miserable sheet. I stepped out of my warm car and pulled the rusty metal dolly carrying my 3 heavy evidence boxes onto the pavement. As I walked slowly across the wet parking lot toward the towering concrete steps of the main building, the local residents began to turn their heads. I saw the familiar, judgmental faces of my father's friends, the prominent local business owners, and the wealthy country club gossips who had happily spread his vicious lies. They huddled under their massive black umbrellas and looked at me with a sickening, heavy mixture of shallow pity and morbid curiosity. It was the exact type of condescending, predatory gaze society specifically reserves for a person who is universally expected to collapse in a public, deeply humiliating spectacle. They openly whispered to each other over the sound of the rain. shaking their heads at the tragic, pathetic downfall of the disgraced Mercer girl. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my eyes locked dead ahead on the heavy double doors of the courthouse. Let them stare. Let them whisper their ridiculous rumors. They honestly believed they had shown up this morning to watch a solitary, broken, defenseless woman get completely crushed by a massive, unstoppable legal machine. In reality, they were about to witness a towering, arrogant local empire being meticulously and brutally dismantled by the exact same hands it had spent decades raising to despise. The echo of my father's opening insult hung heavily in the freezing courtroom air. He truly believed his arrogant statement about my inability to afford a lawyer was the final nail in my coffin. He sat back in his expensive chair, fully expecting me to lower my head in shame. Instead, Judge Celeste Wren looked down from her elevated wooden bench. She adjusted her microphone and formally asked if I had retained legal representation for this mandatory evidentiary hearing. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my dark blue suit. I looked directly at the judge and kept my voice perfectly level. I stated that I was appearing entirely on my own behalf today, possessing the full professional licensing, the state certifications, and the absolute legal capacity to present the forensic record. At the plaintiff table, Vernon Pike was already staring down at the thick black binder I had just submitted to the court clerk. He saw my full legal name printed boldly across the top of the specialized financial exhibits. Lillian M. Watson. He saw the specific registry numbers and the highly unique, surgical formatting of the data reconstructions. The remaining color completely drained from his face. The agonizing memory of a massive, incredibly humiliating legal defeat in Raleigh exactly 2 years ago hit him like a physical blow. The brilliant, remote forensic architect who had completely dismantled his defense strategy and cost his prestigious firm millions of dollars in that famous settlement was not a ghost. She was standing right across the aisle. His heavy gold pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. He froze completely and whispered the words that broke his arrogant facade. My God, is that really her? Randall did not understand the deep, painful legal history between his high-priced lawyer and myself, but my father understood the raw dynamics of power. He turned his head and saw the pure, unadulterated panic radiating from Vernon Pike. In that exact fraction of a second, the mocking smile died on my father's lips. Looking at the terrified face of the most ruthless corporate executioner in the state, my father finally felt a cold, paralyzing wave of genuine fear toward his own daughter. I did not waste the court's time with a dramatic theatrical performance. I did not stand in the center of the room and deliver a tearful, emotional speech about family betrayal or moral failings. The time for feelings had passed months ago. Now was the time for the blade. I opened my files and began systematically linking the heavy steel chains tight around their necks. I introduced the certified server logs that proved the internal identity theft, showing exactly how my administrative access was hijacked from inside the executive suite. I laid out the complex wire transfer receipts detailing the illegal backyard vendor network Cole had built. I presented the forged personal guarantee they had secretly attached to the toxic warehouse site. I displayed the illegally backdated county land deeds side by side with their own internal corporate emails. Those emails explicitly outlined their premeditated intention to shift the massive environmental liabilities onto my desk while hiding the clean assets in newly formed shell companies. The absolute truth did not just come from my mouth. It came from the very people they had casually discarded and manipulated. Milo Serrano took the witness stand and swore under oath that the digital security overrides were authorized entirely by my brother. The senior regional bank specialist nervously testified that millions of dollars in risky commercial credit were only approved because my unblemished professional reputation was attached as a shield to the fraudulent loan applications. Paige Harlan took the microphone and confirmed the blind, illegal money routing through her small landscaping business account, everything perfectly locked together. The invisible, suffocating web my family thought they had so cleverly spun in the dark was now a giant, undeniable steel cage sitting directly under the bright fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The breaking point arrived during cross-examination. I called my brother to the stand. Cole walked up to the wooden box looking like a hollow, terrified shell of the golden boy he used to be. The frozen commercial credit lines and the crushing weight of the incoming evidence had completely destroyed his nerves. I did not yell at him. I did not pace around the room. I stood perfectly still and relentlessly boxed him into a corner, using his own conflicting metadata and his panicked, deleted emails. I handed him a printed server log from a Tuesday night in late October. I asked him to read the Internet Protocol address out loud. Then I handed him the physical security badge swipe records for that exact same night. I calmly asked him to explain to the judge how my verified electronic signature was actively approving a highly toxic waste site assessment at the exact same moment my physical body was logged as being miles away from the corporate building. Under that crushing, clinical pressure, Cole completely snapped. His voice cracked loudly, echoing off the high ceiling. He practically yelled his desperate confession into the microphone. He frantically admitted that they had forged my signature. He tried to save himself by throwing our father directly under the bus. Cole cried out that Randall had explicitly assured him that I would eventually just clean up the massive administrative mess for the family like I always did. He confessed that they truly believed they had the absolute right to use my name and my credentials without ever asking for my permission. Judge Celeste Wren did not need to retreat to her chambers to deliberate. The absolute scale of the financial fraud and the sheer cruelty of the setup were staggering. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing with professional fury, and issued a rapid, devastating series of bench rulings right there on the spot. She instantly ordered a total freeze on all disputed corporate assets across their entire real estate portfolio. She legally and permanently voided the fraudulent personal guarantee bearing my forged signature, severing me entirely from their toxic environmental debt. She granted me full, unrestricted access to the entire history of the corporate records. She officially appointed a ruthless independent forensic firm to audit the entire Mercer holding structure. Before she struck her heavy wooden gavel to close the hearing, Judge Wren looked directly down at my father. She stated for the permanent public court record that my structural role in the Mercer system was a foundational, highly critical pillar of the business. She explicitly noted that my work was never merely basic paperwork support, entirely destroying the pathetic, demeaning narrative my father had peddled to the town for months. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and the gallery began to slowly empty. The heavy, suffocating silence of total, absolute defeat settled over the plaintiff table. Vernon Pike was already packing his expensive leather briefcase, refusing to even look his ruined clients in the eye. I quietly stacked my documents back into the heavy cardboard boxes. Randall slowly stood up and walked over to my table. His broad shoulders were slumped forward. The untouchable titan of Briar Glen suddenly looked like a very old, very broken man. He looked at the massive boxes of evidence. Then he looked up at me. His voice was hoarse and quiet, as he asked if this was my idea of revenge. I looked him dead in the eyes. I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. No anger, no sadness, no lingering desire for his validation. I gave him the cold, precise truth. No, this is the bill for all the times you confused silence with consent. I turned my back on him for the final time. I pushed the rusted metal dolly down the center aisle of the courtroom. I did not stay to claim the broken throne of his crumbling company. I did not want a single dirty brick of his ruined empire. I pushed the heavy double doors open and walked down the wide stone steps of the courthouse. The freezing morning rain had finally stopped, leaving the air sharp and clear. I stepped out into the daylight with my entire identity fully and legally restored. I was no longer a quiet shadow trapped inside the suffocating walls of my father's kingdom. I was a woman who had meticulously rebuilt the truth, entirely by the book, at the exact right moment. I was strong enough to completely dismantle a corrupt local dynasty, and I walked away knowing I had forced the most dangerous lawyer in the room to recognize my absolute power long before my own father ever did. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.